The summer of 1944 was supposed to belong to the victors. After the breakout from Normandy, American forces had raced across France, rolling past hedgerows and villages that only weeks earlier had been in enemy hands. Roads were choked with dust, wrecked vehicles, and civilians waving flags. To many observers it looked as if the armored columns would simply keep going until they reached the German border and beyond. At the tip of this advance drove the 4th Armored Division of the American Third Army. Its tanks and half-tracks carried men who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of war. Long before they saw the fields of France, crews had trained on distant American ranges, grinding through gunnery tables, maintenance drills, and endless field exercises. They learned how to start engines in the dark, how to fix broken tracks in mud, how to read a landscape and find the fold in the ground that might save a tank from a hidden gun. Among these veterans was the 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. He was not a figure of parade ground elegance. Dust clung to his uniform, and he preferred to be near the front of his column where the road was least safe and the information most valuable. His men had come to trust his instinct for when to strike hard and when to disappear behind a hedgerow or a rise in the land. By late September, his battalion had already covered hundreds of kilometers in a campaign that moved faster than most planners had imagined. Yet speed had a cost. Fuel stocks ran thin. Supply lines stretched back across a battered landscape, over bridges that had been blown and rebuilt, through traffic jams of vehicles and horses, of troops moving forward and prisoners being hauled to the rear. Tanks that had been driven hard since July were starting to show their age. Engines overheated. Suspension systems groaned. Crews slept in short snatches where they could, beside their machines or under them, always ready to move again. Ahead of the division lay the rolling countryside of Lorraine, close to the border of Germany. It was a land of small villages, orchards, and open fields broken by low ridges and patches of woodland. To a tank crew it was neither perfect nor hopeless. The wide fields meant long lines of sight, good for gunnery, but the gentle folds of the ground provided concealment for an enemy who knew how to use them. The autumn weather added another layer of uncertainty. Morning ground fog could appear without warning, turning clear vistas into a gray wall that swallowed sound and shape. The American advance had pressed so deep into this region that it began to worry the German high command. For them, Lorraine was not just another patch of countryside. It was one of the last stepping stones before the frontier, the line of defense that might give them time to stabilize a collapsing situation. The rapid American thrust had exposed German units that were still reorganizing after the disasters in Normandy. Reserves were thin. Many commanders looked enviously at the new armored brigades being formed deeper inside Germany, equipped with the latest Panther tanks and other modern vehicles. In the early days of September, as Abrams and his crews probed deeper into Lorraine, staff officers in Berlin and in army headquarters to the east studied their maps. They saw an opportunity hidden inside the danger. The American spearheads were extended, perhaps overconfident, and vulnerable on their flanks. If a fresh armored force could be gathered and hurled against these leading units, perhaps the advance could be broken. The chosen ground was near a modest cluster of farms and fields around a place called Aricourt. On paper it looked suited to tank maneuvers, with open spaces that promised room for fast movement and heavy blows. The new German armored brigades that would take part in this counterstroke were impressive in name and equipment, but far less solid in reality. Many of their crews were newly trained or recently transferred from other branches of service. Some had learned the basics of tank warfare in only a few weeks, rushing through instruction that American crews had absorbed over years. Replacement officers, taught in classrooms far from the front, now faced the task of leading companies they barely knew into combat against experienced opponents. Their machines, particularly the Panther tanks, boasted powerful guns and thick frontal armor. On a firing range or in a technical manual, they looked superior to the lighter American Sherman. While these formations assembled and moved toward Lorraine, the men of the 4th Armored Division continued their own routines. Abrams and his fellow commanders pushed reconnaissance elements forward, searching for signs of the enemy. Artillery observers scanned the horizon from church towers and hilltops. Engineers improved roads and bridges, trying to hold the fragile arteries of the advance together. Maintenance crews worked frantically on engines and transmissions, doing their best to keep worn machines on the line. Far above this activity, a different kind of scout surveyed the land. Major Charles Carpenter flew a small observation aircraft, a fabric-covered plane that could lift off from short fields near the front. From his cramped cockpit, he could see patterns invisible from the ground. Columns on distant roads. Smoke rising where no smoke should be. Tracks in fields where no farmer had recently plowed. Carpenter had taken the unusual step of arming his flimsy aircraft with rockets, turning what was meant to be a passive observer into a nimble attacker. It was an experiment watched with a mixture of amusement and curiosity by those on the ground, but the major understood that any edge, no matter how strange, could matter in the battles to come. Among the enlisted men, rumors flowed faster than official reports. Some said entire enemy divisions had been destroyed and there was little left ahead but scattered resistance. Others whispered of powerful new enemy tanks and secret counterattacks forming beyond the horizon. For Sergeant Joseph Sadowski and many like him, there was little time to dwell on the larger picture. Their world revolved around the steel hull of a single tank, the trust of a crew that shared cramped space, and the discipline of habits drilled over and over during training back in the United States. The weather began to shift as September advanced. Clear days grew less common. Low clouds and mist settled over the Lorraine fields. Dew turned to slick mud under the tracks of passing vehicles. Visibility shortened at dawn and dusk, the very hours when armored units preferred to move and probe. What looked like an empty field at midday could become a maze of half-seen shapes in the early morning, where a tank's silhouette might be visible only as a darker patch inside the fog. Commanders on both sides studied these changes with equal attention. The Americans saw the fog as an obstacle that could hide enemy movement and complicate coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft. The Germans, planning their counterstroke, saw something more promising. Reduced visibility might level the advantage that American air power had enjoyed all summer. If their new armored brigades could strike under cover of mist, perhaps they could close the distance quickly, get inside the effective range of their guns, and deliver a sudden shock to the leading American units. By the third week of September, the stage was set even if most of the actors did not yet know their precise roles. The 4th Armored Division held a broad, lightly woven line around Aricourt and nearby villages, its companies spread out across ridges, crossroads, and patches of woodland. Supply convoys rumbled forward each night, bringing fuel and ammunition along narrow roads that felt longer with every kilometer. To the east and southeast, German columns moved through the gloom, engines muffled and lights blacked out, pausing often as officers struggled to match the planned routes on their maps to the confusing reality of darkened countryside. Between these two forces lay fields that had not yet earned their place in the history books. To a casual traveler, they were simply another corner of rural France, with haystacks, stone farmhouses, and lines of trees following the course of streams. Yet in those fields the coming days would test every lesson Abrams and his men had learned during their long years of preparation. The balance between advanced weaponry and human skill, between hurried formation and seasoned teamwork, was about to be measured in fire and steel across the foggy ground around Aricourt. The first hint that something was changing came not from a map or a message, but from the sound that carried through the mist. Tank engines at a distance made a particular kind of growl, deeper than trucks, more deliberate than tractors. In the gray morning light of Lorraine, men of the 4th Armored Division began to notice that sound coming from directions where no friendly units were supposed to be. It did not arrive all at once. It came in faint pulses, as if the land itself was clearing its throat before speaking. On that September morning, fog lay thick over the low fields around Aricourt. Visibility dropped to a few dozen meters in places. Trees that usually marked field boundaries were reduced to vague smudges. Church spires vanished entirely. Tank commanders who liked to ride with their heads out of the hatch found themselves staring into a blank wall of pale gray. Gunners could not see far enough to use their full range. Artillery observers waiting for lines of sight saw nothing but shifting curtains of moisture. The Americans were used to bad weather by now, but this fog had a different weight. It felt as if it did not merely drift along the ground but clung to it. Somewhere inside that shroud, German panzer crews were advancing. They had been pushed into motion by orders from far above, orders that told them this was the chance to strike a weary enemy and restore initiative. Their leaders carried crisp, newly printed diagrams that showed bold arrows slashing into the scattered positions of the 4th Armored Division. On those papers the distances were short and the objectives clearly labeled. On the actual ground the story was messy. The newly formed panzer brigades had impressive numbers of modern tanks, including many Panthers. Their guns could outrange the 75mm weapons of the American M4 Shermans in clear weather. Their frontal armor could shrug off hits that would have wrecked earlier models. But the crews inside many of these machines had been rushed through training. Some had only fired their guns a few times. Others had little experience with night moves, radio discipline, or the kind of quick coordination that turns a group of tanks into a coherent striking force. As they rolled toward the Aricourt sector, these German units quickly discovered that the countryside did not care about their diagrams. Roads were narrower than they looked on the map. Crossroads were confusing when village names were half hidden by fog and signposts had been destroyed in earlier fighting. Columns became bunched up. Some companies arrived late to assembly points while others got lost or veered off course. In places, tanks had to halt while officers walked forward on foot, straining their ears for any clue about where the enemy might be. On the American side, the loose screen of outposts around Aricourt went about its usual routine. Tanks were dug in on reverse slopes or tucked behind hedgerows. Tank destroyers were positioned to cover likely approaches. Infantry elements held small villages and crossroads, ready to delay any sudden thrust. Abrams and his fellow commanders understood that their line was thin, but they also knew that flexibility was their strength. Units were briefed on how to fall back and reform, how to call for artillery, how to pass information quickly up and down the chain. When the first contacts came, they were sharp and confusing. In the early morning gloom, a patrol of Shermans edging forward along a ridge line suddenly saw dark shapes looming out of the fog. At first they might have been trees or haystacks. Then the shapes moved, and the outlines of turrets and long guns emerged. There was no time for extended maneuver. Both sides fired at almost the same moment, flashes of orange stabbing through the gray. Shells that might have fallen short or gone long on a clear day now slammed into targets at close range. In that kind of fight, the technical advantage of the Panther was less decisive than it appeared in brochures. Its long gun and superior optics were designed to dominate open ground at long distance. Here, in the choking fog, at ranges where silhouettes suddenly appeared almost on top of one another, the quicker turret traverse and better handling of the Sherman could matter just as much. American crews who had spent years practicing fast target acquisition and coordinated fire drills fell back on those habits almost automatically. The machine they knew thoroughly could sometimes be turned faster than a more impressive machine handled by a nervous crew. Reports began to filter back to Abrams's command post. Isolated exchanges of fire. Tanks knocked out. Uncertain enemy numbers. The picture was fragmentary, built from radio calls crackling through interference and the impressions of men who had seen only fleeting shapes. Abrams understood that this was the opening phase of something larger. The enemy was not probing with a few stray tanks. These were the forward edges of a major armored effort. He began to shift his battalion like a craftsman adjusting pieces on a board, pulling some units back from exposed positions, reinforcing others, and preparing reserves to counter any breakthrough. Above the murk, Major Carpenter's small observation planes searched for gaps in the cloud layer. When he could find a space between fog banks, he would dive low, scanning roads and fields for movement. From this higher vantage point, the structure of the German push became clearer. Columns of tanks and supporting vehicles were threading their way through the countryside, some advancing with purpose, others hesitating at crossroads. At times the Major swooped in to fire his rockets at particularly vulnerable groups, more to disrupt and confuse than to destroy entire formations. Every delayed column, every stalled unit, bought precious minutes for the men on the ground. On the ridges and near the villages around Aricourt, gun crews and tank commanders listened to the distant rumble approach. The ground itself seemed to vibrate slightly under the passage of so many steel tracks. American artillery batteries, already registered on key approaches, stood ready to fire missions on short notice. When observers finally managed to glimpse enemy tanks emerging from the fog along a road or cresting a hill, they called down fire that burst among the advancing formations, splintering trees and throwing earth and shrapnel over the paths. Still, the German weight of armor was real. In some sectors they succeeded in pushing local American positions back, forcing Sherman crews to abandon exposed spots and seek new ones. There were moments when it looked, from the narrow vantage point of a single field or crossroads, as if the tide might sweep everything aside. Tanks erupted in flames. Crews scrambled from hatches. Vehicles blocked paths that had been lifelines only hours earlier. The fog made it hard to tell whether the enemy numbers were small or overwhelming. For men like Sergeant Sadowski, these opening engagements were the kind of test that training could never fully simulate. Years of drills had taught him how to load, fire, and maintain his gun under pressure. Now he had to apply those lessons while the world around his tank dissolved into fragments of sound and light. The hiss of the intercom, the thud of a nearby impact, the smell of burned powder and hot metal. Somewhere out ahead, enemy tanks were moving, but the fog turned them into invisible threats that might be 10 meters away or 100. Throughout the day, the battle lines around Aricourt did not settle into a simple pattern. Instead they rippled. A German thrust would punch into a gap, creating a momentary bulge, only to be countered by a swift American response. Small groups of Shermans moved like hunters, using folds in the terrain to get into flanking positions where the vulnerable sides of the Panthers could be targeted. Tank destroyer units, with their open-topped vehicles and powerful guns, picked off enemy armor that blundered into their fields of fire. Each success was local, but together they began to slow the momentum of the attack. As evening approached, the fog that had been both enemy and shield all day started to thin in patches. Smoke from burning vehicles mixed with it, creating strange layers where the setting sun sometimes stained the haze with a dull red glow. On some ridges, crews could finally see more than a few hundred meters, and the wreckage scattered across the fields became visible. Burned-out hulls of Shermans and Panthers alike lay twisted at odd angles, testimony to the ferocity of the day's fighting. Yet the full scope of what had begun around Aricourt was still not obvious to most of the men who had survived those first clashes. For them, the day ended much as it had begun, with engines idling in uncertainty and distant sounds hinting that more armor was still out there in the darkening countryside, getting ready to try again. Night brought no real silence to the Aricourt sector. Engines idled in the darkness as crews worked over their machines with tools and oil cans. Now and then a flare arced up in the distance, casting a brief white light over broken hedgerows and the hulks of burned tanks. The fog that had smothered the first day's fighting thinned after sunset, but low clouds still hung over the countryside, trapping the smell of exhaust and cordite close to the ground. In makeshift command posts, under canvas or inside damaged farmhouses, maps were spread across tables. Lanterns threw yellow circles of light onto penciled marks that showed where contact had been made and where it had been lost again. The Americans pieced together the day's events from reports that did not always agree. Some patrols claimed to have faced a handful of enemy tanks. Others insisted there had been dozens. Yet when the fragments were lined up, a pattern began to emerge. The enemy was not probing with scattered forces. A sizable armored formation was pressing against the thin line around Aricourt with intent and persistence. Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding one of the main combat commands of the 4th Armored Division, studied that pattern with a cold, methodical eye. He understood that brute strength alone would not decide what happened next. His own formation did not have an endless supply of tanks or men. What it did possess was a well-trained staff, experienced battalion commanders, and crews who knew the countryside around Aricourt better with each passing hour. Clark began to shape a defense that would rely on mobility and depth rather than rigid lines. He identified ridges and small rises where tanks could be hidden behind reverse slopes, emerging only long enough to fire before sliding back out of sight. He matched tank destroyer positions to likely enemy avenues of approach, covering open ground that looked inviting from a distance but could be turned into a killing field once German armor committed to it. Artillery batteries were assigned specific sectors, with pre-planned fire missions written out so they could be executed quickly when a forward observer called for help. The idea was not to meet the enemy in a single static wall of steel, but to draw him in, break his formations apart, and then strike back at the exposed pieces. Messages went out through the radio net, adjusting the placement of companies and platoons. Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion shifted some of its forces into concealed positions that would be key to this flexible defense. Crews who had spent the day fighting in the fog now climbed back into their vehicles, moving by night along rough tracks and narrow roads to new locations that existed only as coordinates on a map. They trusted that the men at the top of the chain knew why these moves were necessary, even if they themselves could see only a small corner of the whole. Across the battlefield, the German side experienced the same night in a different way. Their 5th Panzer Army had expected a sharp offensive that would slice into an overextended enemy, recapture key towns, and perhaps collapse the American bridgehead over the Moselle River. Instead, they had found themselves tangled in mist and confusion, suffering losses out of proportion to the ground gained. Their commanders ordered renewed attacks, convinced that persistence and weight of armor could still force a breakthrough. Fresh companies were fed into the front, many of them drawn from hastily formed panzer brigades with crews who had never before fought as part of a large-scale armored operation. Young tank commanders tried to reconcile the neat arrows on their briefing charts with the reality of clogged roads and unexpected resistance. Some units had to sort out traffic jams in the dark as tanks, armored infantry vehicles, and supporting guns all tried to move at once. Fuel trucks hunted for the right columns to refuel. Maintenance teams worked under covered lights to patch up damaged machines, replacing track links, changing road wheels, and coaxing bulky engines into life again. Orders continued to emphasize speed and aggression. The Americans, it was said, possessed inferior tanks that would crumble once confronted by enough Panthers pushing forward together. On the second morning, the fog returned with the same stubborn thickness. It spread over the Lorraine fields before dawn, dulling sound and swallowing landmarks. This time, though, the Americans were better prepared to exploit its strange cover. Clark's plan depended on knowing the ground, and his subordinate commanders had spent the previous days studying every fold in the terrain they held. Tank platoons were positioned where they could remain invisible until enemy armor moved into short range. Infantry and engineers blocked minor roads with obstacles that looked trivial from a distance but forced approaching vehicles to bunch up or turn aside under watchful eyes. As the rumble of German engines grew louder, Sherman crews waited inside their hulls, hatches cracked just enough to let in a sliver of air. The gun breeches were already loaded. Range estimations had been discussed in advance. Gunners knew approximately how far the tree line or the bend in the road lay from their concealed positions, even if they could not see them through the fog in that moment. In some cases, they had practiced dry runs the night before, swinging turrets toward invisible landmarks and rehearsing how they would react when the first dim shapes appeared. When contact came, it was often abrupt. A column of Panthers would emerge along a sunken lane or over a low crest, their long barrels cutting a distinctive profile. Believing themselves still undiscovered, they pressed on, sometimes in tight groups that made sense on a clear training field but turned into liabilities here. From a flank, a pair of Shermans might edge up, fire a quick salvo into the side armor of the lead tanks, then reverse back behind cover before the enemy could adjust. Elsewhere, tank destroyers sat hull down behind embankments, their powerful guns aimed at pre-selected patches of ground where German armor was most likely to appear. The fog made the sequence of events uneven. In one sector, a German thrust might push dangerously close to a village or crossroads, forcing American troops to fall back house by house. In another, the enemy would blunder into a well-prepared ambush and leave wrecks scattered in a field they had barely entered. Forward observers, straining to see through the shifting gray, called in artillery on any confirmed concentration of vehicles. Shells exploded among the panzers, adding smoke and dust to the already limited visibility. Higher in the sky, Major Carpenter hunted for gaps in the cloud cover. When he found a thin patch, he climbed his small observation plane above it, then dropped back down through the mist to surprise columns that thought the weather had shielded them from prying eyes. His armed aircraft was not the only threat from above. As the day wore on and sections of the sky cleared, fighter bombers from the Tactical Air Command arrived over the battlefield. Their P-47 Thunderbolts dove on enemy armor that had been slowed or stopped by ground resistance, striking with bombs and rockets that tore through thin top armor and disrupted already fragile coordination. For Sergeant Sadowski and many crewmen like him, these air attacks were mostly sensed rather than seen. The roar of engines overhead, the distant rumble of explosions, and the sight of columns of smoke rising beyond the next ridge were signs that someone else was hitting the enemy from another direction. Inside the confines of a tank, his world remained focused on the narrow slice of battlefield directly in front of his gun. Targets appeared as fleeting silhouettes, were engaged, and then vanished in flame or into the fog. The routines drilled in training back in the United States guided every movement. Shell casings piled on the floor. Sweat stung eyes already irritated by fumes. The sense of being outnumbered was muted by the constant need to act in the present moment. Clark and Abrams monitored the evolving fight through radio reports. They knew that their battalions were engaged against forces that, on paper, enjoyed clear numerical superiority in tanks and armor. What balanced this disparity was the way their units moved and communicated. Small elements were allowed to act on local initiative, shifting position or launching counterattacks when opportunities arose, without waiting for elaborate instructions from above. When a gap appeared in the enemy's line, a company of Shermans might surge forward to wedge into it, hitting one cluster of Panthers from the side while artillery kept another cluster pinned down. The result was a series of local shocks that chipped away at the coherence of the German offensive. By late afternoon, the second day of heavy fighting had left the ground around Aricourt scarred. Fields that had held crops a few weeks earlier were now churned into mud by tracks and explosions. Smoke from burning vehicles drifted across the countryside, sometimes merging with the lingering mist, sometimes forming dark plumes that marked the sites of particularly fierce clashes. For the Americans, the casualty lists were painful but not crippling. They had lost tanks and men, yet their defensive network remained intact, its connective tissue of communications and mutual support still largely unbroken. The Germans, by contrast, had suffered a kind of unseen damage beyond the vehicles knocked out. Their carefully assembled panzer brigades were no longer the neat formations that had existed on order of battle charts. Units had become intermingled. Replacement crews were thrown into gaps with little orientation. Commanders struggled to maintain control over scattered companies that reported conflicting positions and enemy sightings. The fog and the stubborn resistance had combined to erode the sense of a single, powerful blow and replace it with a grinding series of clashes that consumed fuel, ammunition, and morale at an alarming rate. Yet there was no sign that the struggle was close to ending. Higher headquarters on the German side still believed that victory near Aricourt was possible if only one more coordinated push could be organized. Orders went out for renewed efforts, urging commanders to regroup and try again, to mass what armor they had left and strike toward the villages that anchored the American positions. The men who received those orders knew how much strength had already been spent, but they also knew the cost of refusing. As night approached once more, engines cooled and then restarted as units repositioned in the dark. On the American side, weary crews took brief turns grabbing food and a few minutes of sleep while others remained at their posts. Clark and Abrams adjusted their dispositions yet again, tightening some sectors, leaving others deliberately loose to act as bait. The fog was expected to return with the next dawn, but weather reports also hinted that clearer skies might follow. If that happened, the balance between ground and air, between visibility and concealment, would change again. For the moment, the men on the line measured the future in much simpler terms. Another night to survive. Another dawn to face. Somewhere out in the darkness, beyond the low ridges and the invisible tree lines, enemy tank crews were also waiting beside cold steel, listening to the ticking of cooling engines and wondering how many times they would be ordered forward into the gray fields around Aricourt before the outcome was finally decided. Before the fields around Aricourt filled with wrecked tanks, the men of the 4th Armored Division had already tasted the price of pushing into Lorraine. A few days before the main clash near Aricourt, elements of Combat Command fought their way through the small town of Valhay, not far to the northwest. Their narrow streets and stone buildings turned tank warfare into a close and vicious struggle. Sergeant Joseph Sadowski commanded one of the lead tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion as they entered Valhay under heavy fire. Enemy guns hid in buildings and behind corners, using every doorway and window as a firing slit. As his tank advanced into the storm of shells and bullets, it was hit and set ablaze. His crew bailed out into the chaos, but one man was still trapped inside. Sadowski went back toward the burning vehicle to try to pull his comrade free and was killed in the attempt. His actions in that moment were later recognized with the highest decoration for valor, but on that day his loss was felt at once and deeply within the battalion. The story of Valhay traveled quickly among the crews. Men who had known Sadowski remembered his calm voice on the intercom and his steady hands on the controls. New replacements heard only that a sergeant had gone back into a burning tank for one of his own. The lesson was blunt and personal. The advance into Lorraine was not an unstoppable parade. It was a series of fights where survival depended on skill, timing, and the willingness to risk everything for the crew inside the same steel hull. When the battle lines stiffened around Aricourt a few days later, memories of Valhay and other hard skirmishes were still fresh. The first fog-bound clashes had shown how easily whole formations could vanish into the gray. Now, as the days passed, a different shape began to reveal itself inside the chaos. The German armored brigades were still trying to force a decision with repeated thrusts, but each push came with fewer tanks, less coordination, and a growing sense of strain. For Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the changing rhythm of the battle was felt through the constant churn of radio reports. His 37th Tank Battalion shifted again and again, sometimes holding prepared positions, sometimes lunging forward to exploit a sudden weakness. The battalion had already lost tanks and crews in the first days of fighting, yet it remained a cohesive striking force. Abrams understood that his advantage lay not in thicker armor but in how quickly his units could adapt. When a German attack blunted itself against one sector, he was ready to send a small, sharp counterstroke at the exposed flank. On one of the crucial days around the 20th of September, a German effort formed up under the same low clouds that had haunted the battlefield since the beginning. Columns of Panthers and other armored vehicles moved forward once more, guided by orders that still promised a breakthrough if only enough weight could be thrown at the Americans near Aricourt. The plan on paper called for converging advances that would pinch off parts of Combat Command A and open the way toward the Moselle crossings. On the ground, that plan collided again with the realities of terrain, weather, and experience. As German tanks tried to push through the open fields and along the gentle ridges, they found themselves coming under fire from unexpected angles. Sherman crews had learned exactly where the folds in the land allowed them to lie in wait. When enemy armor emerged from the mist or crested a rise, guns that had been silent a moment earlier spoke in rapid sequence. Hits landed on side armor, on the thinner plating at the rear of turrets, or on the flanks of vehicles that had believed danger lay only ahead. In some sectors, the fog thinned just enough for a new element to enter the struggle more decisively. Major Charles Carpenter, with his small observation plane now armed with multiple bazooka launchers, went hunting in the skies above the battlefield. On or about the 20th of September, he located German armored vehicles moving in support of the attacks near Aricourt. Diving out of the cloud cover, he fired his improvised rocket batteries at their columns, destroying several vehicles and scattering the rest. Newspapers would later seize on the image of a light liaison aircraft turned into a tank hunter, but for the men on the ground the practical effect mattered more. Every stalled column and every wrecked tank meant fewer guns pressing against the thin defensive web around Aricourt. As Carpenter harassed the enemy from above, artillery batteries continued their own relentless work. Forward observers, some perched in church towers, others operating from the edges of fields, called in fire on any concentration of armor they could confirm. The batteries had spent days registering key patches of ground, measuring distances, and adjusting for weather. Now that preparation paid off. When German tanks tried to mass for an attack, shells rained down among them, forcing units to disperse or push forward through smoke and craters that further disrupted formations. On the American side, the cumulative strain was also mounting. Crews had been operating on little sleep, often eating hurried meals beside their tanks while engines were refueled and ammunition restocked. Mechanics crawled over hulls with wrenches and welding torches, patching holes, replacing damaged parts, and coaxing battered vehicles back into action. Some tanks returned to the line bearing fresh scars from earlier engagements, their crews well aware that the next hit might be the one the machine could not survive. Colonel Bruce Clark watched the German efforts with a hard, analytical patience. His carefully layered defense was working, but it demanded constant attention. When one sector held, he resisted the temptation to reinforce it unnecessarily, instead feeding reserves into areas where the pressure seemed likely to build next. He knew that if his command tried to stand rigidly in one continuous line, it would eventually fracture under the sheer weight of armor pushing against it. Flexibility was his answer, and it required trust in the initiative of subordinate commanders like Abrams and the company leaders under him. Inside the tanks and foxholes, the men experienced all of this as a string of tense, overlapping moments rather than a clear pattern. A Sherman crew might spend an hour staring into the fog, hearing only distant echoes of battle, then suddenly face a pair of Panthers rolling into view at close range. A tank destroyer unit might wait in an orchard with engines off, guns laid on a suspected avenue of approach, knowing that once they fired they would reveal their position and become targets themselves. The wreckage on the fields around Aricourt grew denser with each clash. Some German tanks burned fiercely, sending tall pillars of smoke into the sky. Others sat silent with tracks blown off or turrets jammed, mute monuments to a crew that had abandoned them or died inside. American losses were scattered among them, Shermans and tank destroyers knocked out in ditches or on slopes where they had tried to make a stand. The visual impression was still one of brutal balance. Both sides had paid heavily. The hidden weight behind those numbers, however, was shifting. The 4th Armored Division, though bloodied, remained an organized and responsive formation. The German panzer brigades, by contrast, were being ground down not only in machines but in cohesion and confidence. Yet even as reports began to hint that the enemy armor was losing momentum, there was no sense on the line that the ordeal was nearing any gentle conclusion. Higher German headquarters still pushed for renewed attacks. Messages intercepted later would show how determined they were to wrest back control of Lorraine with one more effort. For the men of the 37th Tank Battalion and their comrades around Aricourt, that meant more days where dawn arrived wrapped in fog and the low rumble of engines promised that the next attack was already forming beyond the nearest ridge. By the time the sun rose on yet another gray morning near Aricourt, the men of the 4th Armored Division felt as if the battle had always been there. Days of broken sleep, half-eaten rations, and constant noise had blurred together. Engines coughed to life before dawn, then idled while crews checked tracks and guns by touch more than by sight. Somewhere out in the mist, German armor was regrouping again, searching for another way to break through. Yet beneath that familiar unease, something important had shifted. The first German blows had been heavy and sudden, smashing into thin American screens and forcing hasty moves. Now the pattern was different. Reports coming into Colonel Bruce Clark's command post no longer spoke of fresh enemy companies appearing everywhere at once. Instead they told of smaller groups, badly coordinated, striking here and there and then falling apart under fire. Clark and his staff could see it on their maps, a gradual thinning of the enemy weight pressing on combat command. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams felt that same change through the rhythm of his own battalion. In the first days around Aricourt, the 37th Tank Battalion had been constantly reacting, sliding from one threatened sector to another, plugging gaps and counterpunching wherever German armor appeared. Now Abrams found that he could plan not only to stop attacks but to seize ground in carefully chosen places. His radio orders grew sharper, less hurried, as he shifted from a pure firefighting role toward a deliberate hunt. The weather, which had so often favored confusion, began to cooperate in brief, crucial windows. On one of the key mornings, the fog lifted earlier than expected. Low clouds still hung in ragged layers over Lorraine, but the fields near Aricourt opened up to visibility that stretched for kilometers rather than meters. For the first time in days, gun crews could see entire slopes instead of just the next hedgerow. More importantly, pilots from the Tactical Air Command could find the battlefield again. Thunderbolt fighter bombers, that had been grounded or blind while the mist clung to the ground, now roared overhead. These aircraft did not simply wander in search of targets. During the long weeks of advance across France, the 4th Armored Division had learned how to work closely with the air units assigned to support it. Liaison officers traded information. Forward controllers on the ground marked positions and guided aircraft toward concentrations of armor. When German tanks tried to form up behind a ridge or in a small valley, radio calls turned those assembly areas into aiming points for rockets and bombs. The same speed and flexibility that characterized Abrams's movements on the ground now extended into the sky above him. To the German panzer crews, this change felt like a trap springing shut. For several days the fog had been a shield, hiding their columns from most air attack even while it hampered their own coordination. Now, as they tried once more to gather strength for a decisive push, the clearer skies betrayed them. Thunderbolts swooped down on refueling points and road junctions where tanks and supply trucks had bunched together. Explosions ripped through vehicles that had not even reached the front line. What was meant to be a concentrated strike toward Aricourt became, again, a series of ragged thrusts as battered units arrived late or under strength. On the ground, Abrams took full advantage of the enemy's growing disarray. He knew that the Panthers and other German tanks were still dangerous if allowed to fight on their own terms, using their powerful guns in open, head-on duels. So he refused to grant them that kind of fight. Instead he pushed small groups of Shermans out along the folds of the terrain, sending them to places where ridges curved and sunken lanes twisted between fields. From those positions his crews could watch likely approaches and strike from the side when enemy armor blundered into view. In one sector, a handful of Shermans waited behind a low rise that concealed them completely from anyone looking forward from the German side. The Panthers advancing toward them believed they were approaching only a thin scattering of defenders already reported earlier. As they moved over the crest of a shallow valley, their attention fixed on distant shapes ahead, the concealed Shermans on their flank opened fire almost as one. Shells slammed into side armor that had not been designed to take such punishment. In minutes, more than twice as many German tanks as American lay burning or crippled across the slope, victims not of superior machines but of planning and timing. Scenes like that did not always unfold so cleanly, but they happened often enough to leave a mark on those who survived. German officers who had gone into the battle confident that Panthers could dominate any engagement now found themselves wondering where the next unseen American position might be. Their maps still showed arrows and objectives, but the ground in between had become a maze of potential ambushes. Crews who had trained for bold charges struggled instead with fear of what might be waiting beyond every hedgerow. Major Charles Carpenter continued to carve his own unusual path through the battle. In his small Grasshopper aircraft, now carrying full sets of bazooka launchers, he hunted for columns that had slipped past the main concentration of air power. When he spotted clusters of vehicles trying to use back roads or sheltered lanes, he dove on them in tight spirals, firing rockets at close range and then pulling up hard as tracers reached for him from below. His attacks alone could not destroy an entire brigade, but each successful strike added to the sense among German crews that danger could come from any direction, at any time. Within Abrams's battalion, the grind of these days was relentless. Tanks went into battle in the morning, came back scarred in the afternoon, and headed out again as soon as fuel and ammunition were restored. Some machines finally gave up under the strain, their engines blown or their suspensions ruined by constant pounding across uneven ground. When that happened, maintenance teams stripped them for parts to keep others running. Crews who lost their vehicles were reassigned to different tanks, climbing into hulls that smelled of other men's sweat and bore the marks of previous fights. The battalion as a whole, though, kept its shape. Orders still flowed. Units still moved with purpose rather than desperation. On the German side, the picture grew more chaotic with each failed effort. The panzer brigades that had arrived with such impressive lists of vehicles were now a patchwork of survivors. Tanks from different units found themselves thrown together under hastily improvised control. Radio nets that were never fully tuned became clogged with urgent calls for help, reports of blocked roads, and conflicting sightings of enemy forces. Some commanders tried to obey fresh orders to concentrate for yet another assault toward Aricourt, only to discover that there were simply not enough operational tanks left in their sector to form the kind of spearhead planners still imagined on their situation boards. Colonel Clark, watching from his headquarters, recognized the signs of a foe being slowly unstitched. He did not relax his guard. Even a weakened armored force could still break through if given the right opportunity. But he allowed himself to think beyond pure survival. Where earlier he had focused only on stopping enemy advances, he now began to imagine how his combat command might use its remaining strength to push the Germans back more decisively once their offensive finally snapped. Until that moment came, however, he insisted that every platoon maintain the flexible, layered defense that had carried them this far. For the tankers on the line, such strategic thoughts felt very distant. Their world remained narrowly framed by the edges of their periscopes and the limits of their hatches. A gunner might spend long minutes staring at a familiar patch of field, memorizing every bush and fence post, waiting for any new shape to appear that did not belong. A driver might focus entirely on keeping the tank in a small hollow, ready to move forward or back at a shouted word from the commander. The larger shifts of the battle only filtered down in bits of news between engagements. Someone had heard that a neighboring company had knocked out a surprising number of enemy tanks in one ambush. Someone else said that air attacks had shredded a column before it ever reached the front. Those fragments of success gave the men a different kind of energy. The first days near Aricourt had been haunted by the knowledge that they were outnumbered and facing machines with fearsome reputations. Now, concrete experience had replaced rumor. Crews who had seen Panthers burn under their guns no longer treated them as invincible symbols of German power. They respected them as dangerous opponents, but they also understood in their bones that training, coordination, and terrain could turn the balance. Abrams himself spent much of his time forward, moving from position to position in his own tank, checking on companies at the sharpest points of contact. He believed in seeing the ground with his own eyes and feeling the pace of the fight directly. Men who glimpsed his vehicle near the front lines drew a certain reassurance from the sight. It meant that higher command was not distant or detached, that the decisions shaping their movements were informed by the same smoke, mud, and confusion they lived in. As the days of heavy fighting continued, the tally of destroyed German armor in the Aricourt region climbed toward 200 machines lost, many of them Panthers, while American losses in medium tanks and tank destroyers remained far lower despite the constant risk. The raw numbers told only part of the story. More telling was the contrast between a defender whose internal structure remained coherent and an attacker whose ambitious plans had been eroded into scattered, costly lunges. Even so, there was no moment when anyone on the ground could say with certainty that the battle was nearly over. Messages intercepted later would show how determined German higher headquarters remained, still urging their depleted units to try again, to gather what armor they had left and strike once more toward the villages anchoring the American positions. For the men of the 37th Tank Battalion and their companions around Aricourt, that meant another night of half-sleep beside steel hulls, another uncertain dawn ahead, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the next ridge, someone was still planning one more attempt to smash through the fog-haunted fields of Lorraine.